HR, workforce, and strategic strategies for manufacturing. During this presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A box or the chat box, and we will get back to you regarding your questions. This is being recorded for your convenience, and also if you look in the chat box, there's a link to the slide presentation that Susan is going to be giving today. As we all try to get back, opening our doors through this pandemic, certain things are changing, and there's going to be a new norm for now. And Susan West is a specialist. She's a principal in our Troy office who specializes in HR solutions. So at this time, I'll hand over the microphone to Susan. Good morning, Susan, and take it off.
All right, thank you, Mike. Well, welcome everybody. I'm glad to be here. This is a topic that, although I'm familiar with, every day there's new changes and new dynamics. So I'll be sharing sort of what's top of mind and hot at the moment. So as we know, this sort of started early in the year. We had two major government acts that came out. One of the very first ones was the Families First Corona's Response Act. And as you know, that brought forward information that mainly began to affect employees around leaves. Then we had the additional CARES Act, as it's referred to, that brought a lot of the financial opportunity to employers to choose amongst the things that would work best for them. For many of you, you're right in the middle of the Paycheck Protection Program, making your decisions around that. And so what we found is when not only did the federal laws came out, but then the state orders came out, it forced us to start looking at what are our workforce planning options. And that really began around March 18th through March 24th, when the state initiated, at least in Michigan and many states actually, started to initiate the stay home, stay safe orders. That led us to a lot of discussions on what do we actually do? Do we permanently look at laying some people off? Do we look at furloughs, or what could be called the temporary leaves that also went to a layoff scenario, a temporary layoff? It also represented a reduction in hours. We had some of our clients considered voluntary leaves of absence. We had true terminations. Those have not stopped. However, handling a termination due to a COVID-related issue right now is something I wouldn't recommend. And remote workforces, how do we implement telework opportunities? How do we prepare our employees for remotely working? Who has the option to remote work versus those that could not work because there wasn't that kind of option based on the type of role they had? And then we had the unemployment Workshare Programs. So right around March 24th, a lot of you were also trying to make decisions, and many of you implemented the temporary leave, implemented remote workforces, and so those have been in place. We were then impacted by the CARES Act, and the CARES Act specifically around unemployment brought three different categories into play. One was called the Federal Pandemic Unemployment Compensation, and that's the one option that brought in the extra flat $600 a week in benefits to employees who were laid off. The second was the Pandemic Emergency Unemployment Compensation Act, and that extended the eligibility of unemployment benefits for up to an additional 13 weeks. Now, Michigan and many states had already expanded the unemployment from 20 weeks to 26. So now this brought an additional 13 if an employee had already exhausted their other employment benefits, unemployment benefits. And then the last one was the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance, which really opened up unemployment to a whole new class of workers that typically were not eligible in the past, and that was for independent contractors, what we call gig workers, and the self-employed. Beyond these three things, the CARES Act also expanded the reasons for why a person could go and be eligible for unemployment. So the first ones being diagnosed with COVID, having a member who in the household's been diagnosed with COVID, providing care for somebody who's been diagnosed with COVID. All of these were ones we were already familiar with as it related to mostly the Paid Sick Leave Act. But how it got expanded under the CARES Act was to 7, 8, 9, and 10. So number 7, scheduled to start a job but are unable to do so as a result of COVID-19 public health emergency. Number 8, became a major support for a household because the breadwinner in the household died as a direct result of COVID-19. Number 9, quit their job as a direct result of COVID-19. And number 10, the individual's place of employment is closed as a direct result of the COVID-19 public health emergency. So these began to create a sort of a new level of reasons, and these also were identified by the unemployment that they could self-certify. So if an employee up and quit their job as a result of COVID-19, and in fact, you as the employer had worked for them, what does that mean? And are they truly eligible for unemployment? So that created and continues to create a lot of concern, controversy. We know that the states are still very, very employer friendly, which of course during this period of time, the whole initiative is how do we protect workers? How do we protect not only the financial well-being of the business, but also the employees? What we know is that the idea of quitting work without good cause to obtain unemployment benefits is fraud under the Pandemic Unemployment Assistance Program. It may result in disqualification for benefits and obligations to repay improperly received benefits. So that is what the DOL emphasized, and I think what we're finding is, you'll find out through this presentation, that there's a whole lot of education that needs to go on. So we as employers need to help employees understand their responsibilities and obligations, and how when they're making decisions about returning to work, refusing to return to work, outright quitting, what does that mean to their unemployment benefit? We also know that when the $600 came out, it wasn't exactly clear how it was going to be applied, and clarification came out much later. So what we now know is that if an individual is eligible to receive at least $1 of underlying benefits for the claimed week, the claimant will receive the full $600. So it took a while. Each state was taking a while to get their systems updated for new class of systems, but this additional benefit. And so it was totally stalled. Their reasons for applying for unemployment benefits weren't in the system. We had early unemployment seekers who were applying for unemployment, applying for the incorrect reason. Their claims got denied, and they had to go back and reapply. There was just total confusion. In addition, we had people who were really trying to understand, I want that extra $600. How do I get it? What's going on? What's wrong? I need it, right? I need to make my rent. I'm struggling with the extra healthcare costs. So what we also understood that if for some reason during that particular week an employee got 0 of a weekly benefit amount under the state's guidelines, then they would get 0 of the $600. we know that every employee needs to, at least I'm speaking mainly to Michigan right now, but it's fairly true for all other states, is that you apply and certify your earnings every 2 weeks, but you indicate what you earn for each week. And then your earnings are applied against a calculation, and that will identify whether or not you're receiving that minimum of $1 and therefore the 600, or 0 in a weekly benefit amount and then none of the 600. When all of this regulation came out, the Labor Secretary did make this written sort of statement to the Small Business Administration chief. We want workers to work, not to become dependent on the unemployment system. When unemployment is not the preferred outcome, when government stay-at-home orders force temporary businesses to shut down. So that's been stated. We also know, however, that many states are promoting situations where they are protecting the employee in light of this COVID-related situation. So we know that both employers and the states are going to have to do their own vigilance, if you will, be vigilant around, is this employee truly eligible or not? And I believe it's going to be reconciled over time, but it's our responsibility to not only keep up with what might be happening at the federal level around this guidance, but what are the states saying? Michigan has been pretty clear. They've expanded their reasons for qualifications for unemployment. I know states like Connecticut has basically said, you're going to get an unemployment benefit if you quit, or if there's a return to work. Many of our states have frequently asked questions. So, for example, I received an offer to return to work, but I am concerned about the safety of the position in light of COVID-19. Will I be denied unemployment for that week? And this is Connecticut. If the governor's restrictions are still in place regarding essential and non-essential employment, or you have concerns regarding your specific place of employment, you may have good cause to refuse your employment as it is not suitable due to possible exposure to the COVID-19 virus, and would not be denied benefits on that basis. So once again, the favor is in place of the employees, and as we walk through this presentation, I'm going to share with you where I think we as employers have a lot of responsibility to communicate with our employees what exactly we are doing to make the workplace safe, and to relieve some of those fears our employees might have. The other thing we're seeing being offered is Workshare Programs. So I know, for example, in the state of Michigan and Ohio, there are very clear guides that are available for employers to consider a Workshare program. A Workshare program allows you to have a group of employees who can go on a reduced schedule and still gain some value, a steady value of unemployment. The Workshare program has a special application. You can do it online, or you can do a written application. If you do it online through MyWham, it's just walking through the questionnaire. My understanding is that right now that is a little bogged down, and I am hearing that some employers are not getting through the phone call, the hotline, or online. And so it's one of those things about being persistent, just as we're telling employees, look to get on that line between 8 p.m. and 8 a.m., the non-core hours, and see if things don't process through during those non-busy time periods. We know that Michigan, for example, has widened the scope of eligibility, where before it was 15 and 45% of a reduction in hours and therefore pay. Now they've broadened it to 10% up to 60%. So a lot more opportunity for you to look at how it might apply to your workforce. The other thing we do know, however, is it's by a workers classification grouping. You have to have a minimum of 2 employees. You can apply for up to 52 weeks, but it's got to be for a whole department, a whole section or classification of workers. We had a couple of very small employers who ultimately, even with the expansion, weren't able to qualify because their workers were identified in 2 different worker classifications. So a lot of details for you to consider there. Definitely an option that brings sort of the best of you getting your workers back to work. They're still receiving the benefit of unemployment, and through July 31st would still be able then to get the 600. So very much worth taking a look at. So we have people on layoff, we have people in a remote work schedule, and now we're looking at reopening. We have the opportunity to actually bring employees back into our workplaces. And so what do we need to be aware of there? Well, one of the biggest things I share with my clients is please be aware of what's happening at the state level. As you probably all know, Michigan has put out their, 6 phases for reopening, as many states have. Right now in Michigan, we're in that phase 3 flattening area. And not only does the federal, OSHA, CDC, Michigan, and counties are all giving us guidance on what we should be doing to protect our workforce and what should we be considering as we look to a return to work. So what I've done is I've grouped it into what I consider these core 7 areas. One of the very first ones up here in the left-hand corner is all around your COVID-19 preparedness response plan. I'm going to talk about each one of these categories in detail, but that's probably one of the most critical ones to start working on right now, even before the doors open. A lot of planning that needs to go on, as I'm sure you folks are in the middle of it. Making sure that your compliance notices for the Family First Act are up in a very visible location. Also, please make sure that your other labor posters are up to date, especially any paid medical leaves that are declared by your state. There's been changes to that, so make sure you're up to speed on how those medical leaves might have changed. Michigan implemented one over a year ago. Many employers already have that in place and aligned with PTO or vacation policies, but having the poster up, we're learning through some of our savvy employees that they may not fully understand how that benefit is applied, and therefore are saying how, I'm not getting it, I don't understand, and I'll speak more to that in a moment. Already mentioned making sure you understand what is necessary for your state and county orders. Planning for return to work notices, or just communicating in general what employee status is if in fact not everybody's returning to work, or if we want them to continue into a remote work. So what are all the policies you're going to need to have in place, not only for infectious disease, but also for the Paid Sick Leave Act, for the Emergency Family Medical Leave Act, remote work, travel, and what about policies around personal leave of absence? If people are still out for COVID-related reasons, don't necessarily apply for their own serious health condition, but maybe caring for somebody else or in that fearful category of employees who don't want to return. So how are you going to manage that if they don't fall into a typical leave? And then the last two are all around compensation and benefit, either a reinstatement or some adjustments. Maybe there's reduction in pay, and how are we communicating those changes? And then lastly, we're coming back to work. For some of your employees, they might have already been working remotely. So how do you acknowledge them? How do you make sure that they're engaged, that they're not hitting a burnout point? And then for those that are coming back to work who are coming off of maybe some a relaxing, if you will, a few weeks, now how do we keep them motivated and engaged and keep a pulse on what's happening with individuals who might be struggling a bit with this whole, as we keep referring to, new normal. So first, let's jump into the preparedness response plan. There's so much guidance out there, and I really encourage you to create your, what I call your own checklist. So for every company, as part of your documentation, as part of your demonstration, beyond the visual, physical of seeing personal protective equipment and cleaning and sanitizing materials, how are you documenting what you're doing? And how are you proving that you're reviewing that checklist location by location? Who's actually responsible for making sure that the cleaning and disinfecting protocols that are happening at each location? So there's so much here. I highly recommend that you put together a checklist, that you have somebody who's looking at, you know, what do you have on hand? When do you need to reorder? Who are the service providers that are going to maybe help with the disinfecting? What is the workflow pattern in your actual location? Are you going to have a workflow pattern that says you enter at this door and then you exit through another door? You know, I was surprised when one day I had to go in the grocery store, right? And now I'm going down the aisle the wrong way, and people are saying, ma'am, you're going down the aisle the wrong way. I'm like, what are you talking about? So brand new normal, right? You don't realize. So in the grocery store, just a simple little thing that changed the way in which I approach things, it's going to happen for your employers. So employees, excuse me, when you're bringing them back to work, even before they come back to work, what are you telling them what to expect? Are you going to have to wear a face mask every day? What about how your kitchen or your lunch area will be handled? All these social distancing requirements. So preparing in advance, having your checklists identified and worked through, and identifying who's responsible, and then preparing and educating your employees, not only at the time you send a return to work notice on what you've already done to protect them, but secondly, what do you expect to have them know or train them on the day that they're returning. So for me, this is so critical. As this evolves and we learn more about testing and we learn more about vaccines, now it's what are going to be the protocols here, number 6, what are going to be the protocols around some of those things, and be proactive or thinking about what is the company's policy going to be on these items. I think the other thing that becomes very important is, how do you be clear about how you're going to handle any exposures in the workplace? And again, that should all be part of this response plan, the policies and the practices. What are the notices you're going to provide? How are you going to protect an employee's confidentiality for somebody who may be tested positive? We know, many of you know, OSHA, there's been some concern that OSHA's been a little bit taking a back seat in this, but we also know that they have true guidelines, which all of you should be honoring and looking at. But I believe there's going to be more and more that's coming out in terms of very distinctive guidelines. I know one of the biggest concerns, or not a concern, but what we've heard is, have employers already considered for those employees that need to don more protective gear, and maybe more of your direct care workers, what time do they need to actually don any protective gear you're asking them to wear, and doing any cleaning, sanitizing before the work shift and after the work shift? And are you paying them for that? Are you taking that into consideration? There's already been lawsuits that said employers haven't taken that into consideration, and it's an additional 20 or 30 minutes to an employee's shift that they weren't paid for. So be mindful of those kinds of things. Our current laws that are already in place don't go away, or aren't relieved as related to COVID-19. So we have to be thinking about how do they all play together. The posters, this is an example. We have both the employee rights one, and for federal employees, these are the posters that should be added to wherever you post your labor law posters. There is a frequently asked questions document that goes with this, published by the DOL, and that should tell you how to handle distribution to those employees who are not on site. So please make sure that those are up and in a visible space. We talked about the state orders. One of the main ones I wanted to remind you of, even though we're returning to work, there is a state order that's still in play that says employees may not be disciplined, discharged, or retaliated for a COVID-19 reason. This is creating a lot of confusion, because if an employee is refusing to come to work, how is that handled? Well, in this environment right now, in past, definitely through May 28th, we are not sure how long Governor Whitmer might continue that, but there's no discharging of an employee. So my current recommendation is seek legal counsel if there's something definitely you want to do in terms of exiting an employee right now, and let's make sure it's not COVID related. And if it is, I would definitely seek legal counsel. I would recommend just leave them on inactive, maybe on that personal leave of absence. And do you have a policy that addresses that, so that you're not putting yourselves at risk, but you're also honoring and complying with the law. I do know also, for example, things like not charging your employees for a point system on unexcused absences. That would be something that would be considered disciplinary, and it would be considered, if their excuse for being out was related to COVID-19, I would put any of those absences aside and not count them towards any kinds of point systems or unexcused absences you have right now. I would keep record and keep document of what the employee is saying for the reason for not coming to work, but don't apply it against your typical unexcused absence or attendance point systems right now. So return to work notices. For many of you, you might already have some folks back to work. One of the definite things that I recommend employers do is actually, in the return to work notice, I recommend it being documented, that you actually prepare a letter. You'll be interested to know that the unemployment office, one of the ombudsmen actually said, send it certified mail. So I would want you to make sure you have good contact information for that employee. You need to make your own personal decisions on how you want that notice to get to the employee. But it definitely should include, what is your workplace safety measures that you're putting in place? how are you protecting the employee, the visitors that are coming to the work site, and the fact that you want this to be a continued healthy workplace. So critical number one, make sure that that's in your communication, so you're always reiterating what you're doing to help protect employees from COVID-19 exposure. You would definitely want to have your return to work date, schedule, expectations, what role are they coming to, what time do they report to, who do they report to, so basic details there. If there's any impact to hazard pay or any other things that you want to include that the employee would benefit from knowing, the fact that their benefits are reinstated, that their accruals are being reinstated, that they're being rehired as a not as a new hire. There could be a paragraph that just basically says, please let us know that you're confirming, a check mark that says, yes, I'll plan to be there. The second one would be, no, I'm not planning on returning for these reasons. And then you actually have them type out what those reasons are. What I have found very valuable is then to state, if for some reason there is not a return to work, you are not considering returning to work, please let us know, because it may impact your eligibility for a particular leave, it could impact your benefits, and it could have an impact on your unemployment benefit. So I really like to give them that heads up. I'll go next into the policies. I want you to see that how that's handled when an employee says they're not returning. This would be also, how do you handle any new hires, anybody new that's coming into the workplace? What are you doing in terms of training when they come back on site? And then for many employers, they have might have an EAP program, and they might have other support systems. Many are providing links to the CDC right in their or references to the CDC right in their return to work letter. So just making it comprehensive, trying to communicate all the expectations to the employee, so when they return to work, it's sort of in that no surprise category. If you're going to do any kind of screenings, give them the update before they arrive. Now, if you have a unionized workforce, obviously you have other things you need to consider. Those things around, what are your collective bargaining agreements say? What does it mean in terms of your how you return people? There's probably the same as to how you might have laid off a particular group of employees. So I would definitely get refreshed on what are your requirements in this scenario. So will my employees come back to work? Big question right now. We're finding that yes, the majority of employees are returning to work based on the clients that I'm seeing, but there are those few. Every single client I've spoken to has had a particular instance where they were dealing with either a fearful employee, or they were dealing with what I call the savvy employee. The fearful employee is definitely that one that says, look, I can't be exposed. I'm caring for somebody who's has a compromised immune system at home, so I am not returning to work. We have others who have their own serious health conditions for which they actually have a doctor's note that says they are not going to return until X date. We have child care issues. So that's what I would say are here. There's high-risk individuals. So there's a whole process for communicating with those folks. But then we have the other employees who recognize that there are true scenarios where if they've been exposed to a COVID positive person, or they've been in close contact with somebody with symptoms, there's a period of self-isolate or self-quarantine. And we've unfortunately seen several employees who have indicated that they go off and get some medical diagnosis or not, but we put them on self-quarantine for 7 or 14 days, depending on the guideline. And then, in fact, during that period, they get exposed to somebody else. So it's just very interesting to me how there are many people who really understand that there are state guidelines for this, and you need to be prepared to handle that as well. So a variety of scenarios, and so what are you going to do about that? One of the very important things, I think, is for your leave policies, you have your paid sick leave and you have your Emergency Family Medical Leave Act. How are you declaring what your policy is? What forms are you going to use that would help you have that dialogue and attestation from the employee on their current status? And then what documentation are you going to have to support not only their eligibility, but also support your tax credit? So this piece, I think, is where our planning comes into play, over and above our preparedness plan. Now, this is getting into how do we actually implement the leaves that were, effective April 1, but we haven't had to deal with because nobody's, been in the workspace. They've been on layoff, for example. So one of the very, we had the Emergency Family Medical Leave Act. This was for 12 weeks of pay. It's for one qualifying reason only, and that's for an individual who has no child care due to a school closing, or no child care because their daycare provider or regular child care provider is closed due to COVID-19, closed or unavailable. So this particular Emergency Family Medical Leave Act is different than the Family Medical Leave Act. And so every employee, unless you're under the small business exemption, is required to take a look at this. And so how do you have the process in place to qualify individuals? We actually recommend that you have a form. We have these tools available for you if you ever wanted them, but you would have a form that you would actually walk through the employee with, have them attest that yes, it's their child, yes, that there's no other suitable childcare available. And this would also allow you to talk with them about intermittent kind of leave, so that maybe they can only work Monday, Wednesday, Friday, but they need the leave for Tuesday, Thursday. And that has to be an employer authorized and an employee agreement. So a lot of practices around use of this. Then you have the Emergency Paid Sick Leave Act, and this is that 80 hours of sick leave. If somebody is actually ill with COVID-19, that's used in a continuous period. It could also be used in conjunction with the Emergency Family Medical Leave Act for the first 2 weeks, because the first 2 weeks of that is unpaid, but you could apply this. This has 6 reasons for which an employee could be eligible. The 6th one is not fully defined right now. We know that there could be a domino effect or a delayed impact that comes from COVID-19. And so that conditions, or those conditions, are not identified. This is just, I think, a protected category for future that the Health and Human Services has put out there. But 1 through 5 could apply. I think number 1 here, the employee is subject to a federal, state, or local quarantine or isolation order. So that was creating a lot of confusion when it first came out. We've now gotten more definition on that. But we know that there can still be individuals who are truly impacted under this. And so we need to do our homework as an employee comes back to us and says, I am not returning to work, and they describe why they're not being returned to work. It's absolutely our responsibility to have an interactive dialogue with them to understand what is their situation. it may even be that they're not eligible for these two leaves, or they're eligible for the paid sick leave under the American Disabilities Act. So their stress or their anxiety levels those are two conditions that could in fact be covered under ADA. And so not only do we have these two laws in place, but now we have the ADA law that could have an interplay with it. My further, as we know, we have some documentation and that would help support whether somebody's eligible. And so my recommendation is to all employers that you have a very clear process in how these communications with employees are going to be handled. How do you make sure they're handled confidentially? How do you have somebody involved that's handling it consistently? So the same kinds of questions are being asked of those employees, the same kind of action steps are being handled. Exactly what do you do when somebody who has no eligibility, no documentation, and so therefore really isn't eligible for one of these leaves, has no COVID symptoms, so isn't eligible under their a health condition, and just doesn't want to return to work. So that puts us in that whole case of, you know, we have a true refusal. What are we going to communicate with that employee, and how is that employee going to be handled, especially right now under Michigan's state order that there's no discharge, and this would definitely be in the employee's mind a COVID-19 related reason. All of that should be documented. What you would do if the employee is still on unemployment, you would notify them that we have actively provided you with a return to work notice. You are in fact refusing to return to work with no valid reason, as we've talked about, outside of just your own fearfulness. Then you need to be aware that when we receive your unemployment benefit claim, we are going to let unemployment know that we had an opportunity for you to return to work and you refused, and that could in fact impact your unemployment benefit. Now it's up to the unemployment to make that decision. We do not make those decisions on who's eligible or not eligible. However, where you contesting that and actually providing the documentation that shows you had provided them a return to work letter, that you are, I would actually put in there and highlight the kinds of things where you've communicated that you've put a healthy workplace protection practice in place, the preparedness. Because if they're fearful, but you can demonstrate you've been taking all the right steps, now you've just put in a very clear defense mechanism to say, no, we are looking out for our employees and we are communicating that to them with all that we're doing, and we've communicated to them all their rights. So that takes us now to, compensation and benefits. How are you looking at your different programs? What about requests for loans under their 401ks? What about distributions? Are you going to put in a hero pay or hazard pay? Are you going to do what I've seen some ideas around go-getter bonuses? Thank you for returning to work and sticking with me. What about any ancillary benefits? Have your benefits been in effect during this layoff period? And are your ancillary benefits now back in place? We saw some employers keep the medical, but they turned off the ancillary. So all those conversations around what's happening with benefits. Is there a reduction in pay, and for how long will that reduction in pay be? So all that communication around what's happening to commissions and merit raises and base comp. Please be prepared to know what your plan is and answer those questions, because they are definitely going to come up. And lastly, all around employee engagement. So I've seen several employers who have definitely done what we call pulse surveys. So what I mean by that is they're getting input from the employees. We know we have a partnership with Gallup, and we know that employees want their opinions to be understood. And so there's lots of options here, how you're going to update your employee handbooks, your communicating policies. So lots of good things to be considering around keeping the energy up as people are returning to work. Wow, we covered a lot of ground, Mike.
Thank you so much, Susan, for illustrating your knowledge in this area. I do believe we have some questions if you go into the Q&A box. I think you touched upon most of them, but if we just want to maybe go through those.
Okay.
Would you like to just go through them, or would you like me to read them out for you?
Nope. Well, why don't you start while I get organized enough to pull them up?
Okay. Do you have any information as to whether an employee can collect unemployment while on approved FMLA? The employee would be paid in full under the company's PPP loan write-off.
So the answer to that is no. So if you are on unemployment, that means you're on a reduced work schedule or you're not working. That's the reason for unemployment. If you are on an approved leave with a company, in essence, that's working, especially if you're being paid under the Paycheck Protection Program, that means you're actually receiving funds. And so therefore, the employer would be communicating that you have being paid and would contest it. But if you're on a reduced schedule, then that could be a different scenario. And if your FMLA was unpaid, you aren't receiving funds, but you're still under a benefit leave. That one, the employer would have to provide information back to the unemployment agency for an employee who made that kind of claim. And it would be case by case, Mike, in that scenario. But typically, no would be the answer.
The second question is right around the same line of questions. Can an employee collect unemployment while on an approved FMLA leave? The first 2 weeks would be paid under the CARES Act. The remainder would be unpaid.
Well, no. So, well, first of all, I think we're talking about the Emergency Family Medical Leave Act, which means that the employee should be being paid 2/3 of their regular rate up to $200 maximum per day. So there already is a pay cap or pay offered for the days that they're eligible to be on the Emergency Family Medical Leave. If you're on that kind of a leave, then you're not eligible for unemployment. And you should be declaring that as an employee. So once again, and I think that might have related to the one above, the Emergency Family Medical Leave. So in that case, it would be the same. The answer would be no, because you're receiving some benefit and payment from the employer for being on that type of leave. Sorry, okay. The two different leaves get me even confused. I have to think it through.
One employer thought the furlough would last a couple of weeks, and we covered the employee portion 20% of insurance premiums. How are employers recouping the employee portion as this drags on?
Wow, yeah. So one of the things that when we put people on layoff, I had asked our employees to be pretty clear about how that was being handled. Right, so if you put them off on leave and you were actually taking care of that and weren't requesting employees to pay it while they were off, you should have also identified how would it be handled when they return. Or were you going to just acknowledge we're paying it with you have no responsibility? So now you're returning your employees to work. You definitely need to be communicating that they will have this reinstated. It will be deducted out of their paychecks going forward. So how are employees recouping the employee portion? Is this right? Again, you need to be clear. What is your practice you're going to take into place under the Paycheck Protection Program? Yeah, maybe you are hitting levels that allow you to have some of that counted in your payroll numbers. You need to make sure you're dotting your I's and crossing your T's on that, because I know there's a maximum there as well. but you need to be communicating to the employees what their responsibilities are and where you're handling that.
Okay. At what point can or should a furlough become a layoff and terminate benefits, issuing COBRA notices to our employees?
Yeah, so it's been an interesting process. So what we know, for example, I'm going to use Blue Cross Blue Shield, which is one of our main insurance providers, here in Michigan and other states as well. But you should check with the insurance provider that you have. But in the Blue Cross Blue Shield instance, they were allowing end of the month plus 1 month. So if somebody was exited in April on a layoff, a furlough, their benefits could be covered through the end of April plus 1 month, which would be May 31st, if the employer paid the full premium amount. That has nothing to do with the employee contribution. That's sort of tied to that earlier conversation. You need to decide what you're doing with your employees on that. But as long as the bill was paid in full by the employer, then you had coverage. Your employees could have coverage. At the end of that May 31st, if that employee is not recalled to work, it's a decision-making point. And at that point, that would be considered a qualifying event because their benefit would end, and that's when a COBRA notice could be sent. If it looks like, now we're in, I guess, extended times where we've seen these state orders, even federally, have this whole reopening delayed. I would again stay in communication with your insurance providers to say, can it move into end of month plus 1 month plus 1 more month, especially if your employees are still off and you want to continue to provide. All I can say is that if you had them go into COBRA, which is an option, and let's say the employer wanted to pay for 1 month of COBRA, they'd have to do it consistently. You can't pick and choose who you would do that for and who you select not to. So yeah, it's again a dialogue with several parties, your benefit broker, the insurance provider, and then truly what program are you under in terms of a paycheck protection program, just your own cash flow scenarios, but clear communication to your employees.
Thanks, Susan. I think these next two questions came out before we got to the end of your deck slide.
Okay.
I think you touched upon both of these. What if an employee refuses to come back to work when an employer has offered telework?
Yeah, same scenario. You offered work, they refuse to come back to work. You need to understand why. And that's that whole dialogue. Don't just accept it at base surface. You need to understand if they're eligible for another leave that by law you need to pay. And if you haven't done your homework and later they come back and say, hey, I was out for this reason and they didn't pay me my paid sick leave, now you're liable. So that dialogue with that employee to fully understand why they're not coming back to work becomes a critical discussion.
I think it was one of your last slides you did touch upon this. Do employees get both the paid FMLA and once exhausted then get the unpaid FMLA?
So the Emergency Family Medical Leave Act is only for the one qualifying reason around child care. If an employee has already used FMLA, a traditional FMLA, for another reason, then they only get the Emergency Family Medical Leave Act for the balance of 12 weeks that were not used. So that's one question. The second is it relates to the paid portion and the unpaid portion. Well, if it's emergency family medical leave, they get 2 weeks of unpaid upfront, but those could be substituted with paid sick leave, the 80 hours, and then the next 10 weeks should be paid at the 2/3, which is the 2/3 of the regular rate up to $200 maximum. Again, that's also a dialogue to say, if the employee at some point has child care available, then you should be having a dialogue so that they can check back in and say, yep, I can now come back to work. I have child care support. And so therefore, the FMLA would end, I would guess you would say. We do know that daycare providers are opening, that there are options out there now. We're moving into a scenario where the schools would be opening anyway, and there should be some options. But that's, again, another dialogue with that employee to understand their particular circumstance.
Okay, and this last question, this employer is an essential business, but because of the COVID shutdown, they've been very slow. They've been starting to bring back some employees, but not bringing all the employees back because of the business being a little bit slower. So are those people that are not called back eligible for the COVID unemployment?
Yes, yes, I believe so. Again, if it's due to a reduction in business and no work due to COVID-19 in a sort of a phased approach to reopening, then yes, they would continue to stay on unemployment. Again, I would have a communication even to those that you haven't returned with this initial return to keep them in loop on what's happening. At some point, Mike, I think at the end of May or when the whole phased approach comes through, employers are going to have to assess, do I need all my employees back? Will I ever return to my, original normal workload and work need levels in terms of staffing? And then that's a whole nother conversation. Between now and May 28th, wouldn't recommend discharging anybody or putting them on what I would call permanent term layoff. I would wait till after we understand what Michigan state orders say. But at that point, yeah, I think we all need to be making decisions, and how you handle reduction in force at that time has to be based on business need with some very clear criteria on who you're selecting, things like seniority, performance, classification, cross-train, skill sets. All of those should be used as our decisions for making our decisions on who should return and who are we actually selecting to terminate their employment.
And then one more just came in. I think this was what you were categorizing as a savvy employee. Well, another one just came in as well. What if an employee refuses to return to work because they don't want to wear a mask?
Well, I'm not sure I have a very specific answer for that one quite yet. I would, we're following the law, right? It's a state order. So I do know, there's language for saying if it's uncomfortable or it causes problems for you to actually wear a mask. There is communication on that. I would say, is there an opportunity for them to do some sort of telework? It's like, again, a discussion. Why? What's a specific circumstance? Is there any other options for us to manage their whatever skills they have to accommodate? To me, that would be a case-by-case discussion.
Okay. This last question, I think I know the answer with, but I'm going to stay away and let you handle it.
Oh, no.
This employer received the PPP loan, and they are asking if they can recall laid off employees and put them on payroll, even if they are not returning to work yet.
Actually, I believe the answer to that is yes, Mike, but I wouldn't mind if you jump in.
That would be my first blush as well. The PPP loans were intended to keep people on payroll and so off on unemployment. So my suggestion would be yes, that they do qualify.
We do know that creates a whole nother dynamics. Why am I paying employees for them when they're not working, right? And so again, I think it's important for employers to be communicating the why of things and the status of things, so it doesn't look like it's a new norm, and that we're in a unknown territory, we're in a phased approach, but here's where we are today, and here's our responsibility as an employer, and here's yours as an employee, and it's the best we can do.
And just to add some commentary to that, so when the PPP loan came out, we didn't know how long we were going to be in shelter in place. And so you needed to spend that money with, I think it was 6 or 8 weeks regarding payroll. And as we keep on extending these shelter in places, I can see legislation or at least the DOJ to extend those weeks once you've received those funds. But that's just some side commentary.
Yeah, you know, Mike, it feels like hands are tied, right? We have options, but we don't, because they overlap, and each one sort of has its own limitations. And so it takes a savvy business owner these days to make these decisions with
Yes,
support, right? You've heard me say, don't go it alone, right?
Right. And also, as you always said, seek legal advice too. We're at the 10 o'clock hour, so I want to thank everyone for participating, and to let you know that this is the first of a series of webinars for manufacturers. Next week, you'll probably be receiving some information regarding the PPP loan, the loan forgiveness, some tax solutions with respect to the CARES Act. And then the third webinar is going to be associated with IT security. I was reading a report yesterday that ransomware is up 148% since the pandemic started. So as companies and manufacturers start working remotely, and your employees, what security do they have on their own internet? So I think that will be a very important webinar as well. So please be on the outlook for that. After this webinar is completed, you'll probably be receiving emails with the slide deck and additional information regarding this webinar. So thank you everybody for attending, and we look forward to seeing you at the next webinar.
Bye, thanks.
Bye, Susan.